Ed Sullivan was a man millions welcomed into their homes every Sunday night, but behind the stiff smile and the wooden gestures was a life shadowed by grief, secrets, and contradictions. Born into tragedy, he learned early that loss was a constant companion, and that same shadow followed him throughout his career. Though he rose to become the most powerful man in American television, the truth of his temper, his loneliness, and his painful final days was carefully hidden from the public eye. Today, we pull back the curtain on a figure who seemed untouchable on stage, but who, in reality, was as fragile as the artists he introduced. A childhood shaped by loss and discipline. Edward Vincent Sullivan entered the world on September 28, 1901, in Harlem, New York City. He was born a twin, but his brother Daniel was sickly and died within months, leaving Ed to carry the weight of survival. His parents, Peter and Elizabeth, raised 8 children in total, but only 5 lived past infancy. The constant presence of death in the Sullivan household left scars that never truly healed. When Ed was 5, his baby sister also passed away, prompting his mother to move the family to Port Chester in hopes of escaping the memories of grief that haunted Harlem. In Port Chester, music became both an escape and a comfort. His mother often played the piano, and the family sang around it, using melodies to push back sorrow. The young boy grew up listening to the sounds of Irish ballads and American popular songs on the family phonograph. Even in his later years, Sullivan would often reflect on how those nights of music carried him through the silence of loss. At St. Mary's High School in Port Chester, Sullivan poured his energy into sports. He became a halfback on the football team, a guard in basketball, a sprinter in track, but it was baseball where he truly excelled. As catcher and captain, he earned 12 athletic letters and led his team to championships between 1916 and 1919. Sports gave him structure and discipline, as well as a sense of control in a life marked by uncertainty. He liked being the captain, giving orders, and shaping the outcome of the game, qualities that would later define him as a television host and gatekeeper of talent. In 1918, with World War I raging, 17-year-old Ed even ran away to Chicago in an attempt to enlist in the Navy. He was turned away for being too young, but the attempt revealed his boldness. When he returned home, he found another passion that would last a lifetime: writing. He began contributing sports columns to the Port Chester Daily Item, where he was eventually hired full-time after graduation. What began as sports coverage would soon turn into a career that touched every corner of American entertainment. The struggles of journalism and the rise to Broadway gossip. Ed Sullivan's early years in journalism were anything but stable. After his start at the Port Chester Daily Item, he joined the Hartford Post in 1919, only to watch it fold within a week. It was an omen of what would become a recurring theme in his life: progress followed by collapse. In the 1920s, Sullivan bounced from one newspaper to another, moving through the New York Evening Mail, the Associated Press, the Philadelphia Bulletin, the Morning World, the Morning Telegraph, the New York Bulletin, and the Leader. Each closure or layoff would have discouraged a weaker man, but Sullivan refused to quit. These years hardened him, teaching him to adapt quickly and build contacts wherever he went. By 1927, he landed at the Evening Graphic, a tabloid infamous for its flashy, often scandalous content. Here, Sullivan finally found footing. Starting as a sports writer, he rose to become sports editor and eventually Broadway columnist, stepping into the very space left behind when Walter Winchell moved on. This rivalry would define much of Sullivan's life. Winchell thrived at the Stork Club, while Sullivan established his base at the El Morocco nightclub. Both men wielded enormous power. One mention in a column could build or destroy a career. But beneath the glamour, Sullivan remained restless, hungry for more influence. haunted by the memory of his years of instability. His column, Little Old New York, became his signature after he joined the New York Daily News in 1932. For 42 years, until 1974, readers devoured his daily dispatches. He wrote about Broadway openings, backstage feuds, and rising stars, carefully balancing sharpness with fairness. A single line in his column could turn an unknown actor into a household name overnight. Sullivan understood the power he now held, and he used it ruthlessly when crossed. Even as he gained prominence, Sullivan's personal life reflected the losses that had marked his youth. In 1927, he was engaged to Olympic swimmer Sybil Bauer, but she died of cancer at only 23, leaving him devastated. 3 years later, in April 1930, he married Sylvia Weinstein, despite family opposition to their interfaith union. For decades, Sylvia would be his most trusted confidant. After every broadcast, Ed called her for an honest critique. Yet even within marriage, Sullivan carried the scars of loss, his temper sometimes erupting without warning, his emotions locked behind a stiff exterior. From radio to The Ed Sullivan Show and the birth of a television institution. By the early 1930s, Sullivan had outgrown the role of a mere columnist. He was eager to reach a wider audience, and radio gave him that chance. In 1932, he hosted The Ed Sullivan Show on CBS Radio, introducing stars like Jack Benny to new listeners. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, he built a reputation as a master of ceremonies, presiding over vaudeville revues and variety programs. He hosted Ed Sullivan Entertains from 1936 to 1952 and emceed major venues like the Paramount and Loew's State Theaters. Radio expanded his influence, but Sullivan wanted something greater: television. In 1947, an advertising executive named Marlowe Lewis spotted Sullivan hosting the Harvest Moon Ball at Madison Square Garden. A year later, CBS took a gamble and launched a Sunday night variety show with Sullivan as host. On June 20th, 1948, Toast of the Town premiered. The debut lineup included Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, dancer Catherine Lee, pianist Eugene List, and even Rodgers and Hammerstein. With its blend of highbrow and lowbrow entertainment, the show instantly connected with American families. But critics were merciless. Harriet Van Horn dismissed Sullivan as a man with no personality. Time magazine compared his smile to someone sucking a lemon. Audiences, however, felt differently. They didn't want a flashy host. They wanted someone who would step aside and let the performers shine. Sullivan's stiffness, once seen as a flaw, became part of his charm. His awkward mannerisms were imitated by comedians, and he even learned to laugh at himself, making the wooden delivery a national trademark. By 1953, the show moved into CBS Studio 50 on Broadway, a grand theater later renamed the Ed Sullivan Theater in his honor. In 1955, the show was officially renamed The Ed Sullivan Show, cementing his role as the face of Sunday night television. What followed was nothing short of historic. Elvis Presley electrified audiences in 1956, though Sullivan famously ordered cameras to show him only from the waist up. The Beatles' February 9, 1964 appearance drew 73 million viewers and marked the start of the British invasion. Week after week, the stage introduced Americans to groundbreaking acts: the Supremes, the Temptations, James Brown, Richard Pryor, Carol Burnett, and countless others. For 23 years, Ed Sullivan became the nation's cultural gatekeeper. Controversy, control, and the temper behind the smile. For all the goodwill he earned as a promoter of talent, Ed Sullivan also built a reputation for being controlling and unpredictable. He ruled his show with an iron hand, and those who defied him paid a steep price. The contradictions of his public image and private behavior were stark. One of the earliest public clashes came on November 20, 1955, when Bo Diddley appeared on the program. Sullivan had instructed him to perform 16 Tons, a hit song by Tennessee Ernie Ford. But when the cameras went live, Diddley chose to play his own song, Bo Diddley. The crowd roared, but Sullivan was livid. Backstage, according to witnesses, he accused Diddley of betrayal, even using a racial slur in his fury. Staff had to separate them as tempers flared. Diddley was banned from the show forever, his career hurt by the blacklisting. Sullivan's strictness continued with the Rolling Stones in January 1967. Ordered to change the lyrics of Let's Spend the Night Together to the more family-friendly Let's Spend Some Time Together, the band reluctantly agreed. But Mick Jagger rolled his eyes into the camera every time he sang the altered words, a subtle act of defiance. The performance became infamous, a small rebellion on live television. Later that year, the Doors refused to alter their lyric Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher in Light My Fire. Jim Morrison sang it unchanged, and Sullivan exploded backstage, declaring they would never appear on his show again. Morrison coolly replied, "But we just did." Even comedians weren't safe. In October 1964, Jackie Mason's career nearly collapsed after Sullivan misinterpreted his finger gestures as obscene during a live broadcast. Mason lost a 6-show contract worth $45,000, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands today. It took him nearly 20 years to recover from the stigma. Behind closed doors, Sullivan's temper was no less destructive. His daughter Betty later revealed how quickly he could erupt at home, slamming doors over the smallest disputes. He was also suspicious, once grilling Betty about a boyfriend he feared was a communist during the paranoia of the Cold War. Though he presented himself as fair and supportive of black performers on stage, privately his anger and mistrust often bled through. To his family, the beloved host was a man whose warmth could vanish in an instant. Fame, family, and the lonely life behind success. As Ed Sullivan's fame grew, so did the contradictions in his life. On stage, he appeared calm, stiff, and endlessly polite, a man who seemed to belong more to the background than the spotlight. Off stage, his family remembered him as deeply private, sometimes distant, and often consumed by suspicion and control. Betty Sullivan, his only daughter, later explained that while the world saw a warm host, at home he could be moody, quick to anger, and nearly impossible to predict. His grandson, Rob Precht, described him as someone who had built an emotional mask, shaped by the early deaths of his twin brother and younger sister, that made it hard for him to express tenderness even with those closest to him. Ed's marriage to Sylvia Weinstein, begun in 1930 after years of disapproval from both of their families, became the central pillar of his life. They lived in a suite at the Delmonico Hotel in Manhattan, never cooking meals at home but instead dining in restaurants and clubs. Even their daughter Betty often ate with a paid companion until she was 12. Sylvia, however, was more than just a wife. She was his most trusted critic. After each broadcast, Ed would call her immediately to hear her honest assessment of the show. He relied on her judgment in a way he rarely admitted to others. In public, the Sullivans lived like celebrities, dining at the Stork Club or Danny's Hideaway, mingling with politicians, actors, and musicians. Ed's influence was so great that he befriended U.S. presidents and even had audiences with popes. Yet despite these connections, his personal life often seemed hollow. Betty eventually married Bob Precht, producer of The Ed Sullivan Show, and gave her father 5 grandchildren. But even with family around him, Sullivan remained a solitary figure. His dedication to his work consumed nearly every part of him. By the time CBS canceled his show in March 1971 during the Rural Purge, Sullivan was devastated. Angered, he refused to host the final months of scheduled programs. Reruns filled the gap, and when the last episode aired in June, it played without him. The end of an era, but also the start of his personal decline. Decline secrets, and a tragic end. After the cancellation of The Ed Sullivan Show, Ed tried to remain tied to the network that had defined him. In June 1973, he hosted a 25th anniversary special, revisiting the highlights of his long career. But the truth was unavoidable. Television was changing, and Sullivan no longer belonged to the new era of programming. What had once been his empire now seemed like a relic. For a man whose entire identity was built on control and influence, the loss of his show felt like a personal defeat. Tragedy struck the year before when his wife Sylvia died on March 16, 1973. After more than 4 decades together, her absence left Sullivan hollow. She had been the one person he trusted to tell him the truth, the one who kept his ego in check. Without her, he grew even more withdrawn. Friends recalled that after Sylvia's death, he seemed lost, as though the driving force of his life had been taken from him. In September 1974, doctors discovered that Sullivan had advanced esophageal cancer. His family made the painful decision not to tell him, fearing the news would crush him. Instead, they let him believe his illness was nothing more than complications from ulcers. To the end, he never knew the real diagnosis. Just 5 weeks later, on October 13, 1974, he died at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, only days after his 73rd birthday. The funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral, drawing 3,000 mourners who braved cold rain to pay respects. Among them were celebrities, politicians, and ordinary viewers who had grown up with him as part of their Sunday ritual. He was laid to rest in a crypt at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. In the years that followed, honors came quickly. He was posthumously inducted into the Television Hall of Fame in 1984. His star at 6101 Hollywood Boulevard continues to attract visitors. Yet the legacy of Ed Sullivan remains bittersweet. A man who introduced America to Elvis, the Beatles, and so many others, but who died with secrets, temper, and loneliness overshadowing his triumphs. Ed Sullivan's life was filled with contradictions. He gave joy to millions but carried pain he rarely showed. He opened doors for countless performers yet often closed himself off from those closest to him. His story reminds us that even legends are not immune to tragedy. Do you think Ed Sullivan will always be remembered more for the stars he introduced or for the secrets that shadowed his own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about the untold lives behind television's greatest icons.